Hey everyone, we're going to start Unit 2, learning about Edgar Allan Poe. Some of you may have read something of his before. Some of you may know who he is, but never have read anything. And some of you may not have any idea who he is. So we're going to go ahead and dive right in with some notes. This is the agenda for 2 days. We will do our introduction to Edgar Allan Poe will take 2 days. You should have done the gallery walk already, and then you also should have done the Google form for the introduction to Poe. And now you are on notes. That's today on Edgar Allan Poe, and then the next assignment will be notes on his poetic principles. So that's just things that he believed that poems should have. So today we're just going to learn about him, but you should not be doing this assignment if you've not completed 1 and 2. So make sure you do the gallery walk and the introduction to Poe Google form before you continue this assignment. All right, so we're talking about his early life. I'm just going to dive right in here. He was born in Boston, Massachusetts on January 19, 1809. He is the second son of traveling actors David Poe Jr. and Elizabeth Arnold Hopkins Poe. However, in 1811, Elizabeth died, probably of tuberculosis. That was a common illness. It's a bacteria in your lungs. It can be cured today, but back then they didn't have antibiotics, and so it killed a lot of people. And Poe and his siblings became orphans because Poe's dad was a deadbeat. He abandoned them. So Poe was taken into the home of John Allan, who was a wealthy merchant in Richmond, Virginia. A merchant is just somebody who sells stuff. Okay. So although John and his wife Frances never formally adopted Poe, they did raise him as their own son. They coddled him and spoiled him. The Allans baptized Poe with the middle name of Allan. So their last name became Edgar Poe's middle name. So he became Edgar Allan Poe. So that's where his name comes from. In 1815, he moved with his foster parents to London, where John Allan established a branch office of his tobacco trade firm. He attended 2 boarding schools where he earned high grades in Latin and became acquainted with William Shakespeare's works and other British authors. So he went to school in England, in London, and he went to boarding school, which is, of course is expensive, and he did really well in language and reading. Okay, after his business failed in 1820, Allan, his father, his foster father, adopted father, resettled his family in Richmond, Virginia. So they moved to England for 5 years and then they came back to Richmond, Virginia. Poe often showcased his athletic skills by challenging classmates to running races, boxing matches, and jumping contests. Possibly on a bet, Poe once swam 6 miles against the tide down the James River. So not only was he very good in school, especially in English-related subjects, but he was also a very good athlete. All right, so here's going to be our first stop in our Ed Puzzle assignment. This would have been a think, pair, share, as you can see, but you'll just be doing it on your own. Letter A, do you think artistic ability is genetic, meaning are you born with it? Or is it based on the way a family or society nurtures the ability? So are you born with artistic ability, or could you be encouraged to develop an artistic ability in a family or in a society, and then to explain. And then letter B, in families you have known, including your own, have children chosen career paths similar to or different from their parents? So this is just your own experience. Do you look around and see a lot of people following career paths similarly to their parents or their families? Yes or no? All right. So this is where I will pause the video and you will answer the questions. I'm just going to pause here now. Okay, on to the University of Virginia and West Point. In 1826, at the age of 17, Poe entered the University of Virginia. The university's student body was rowdy and poorly behaved, and drinking and fighting and gambling were all common. In one particularly bad fight, Poe suffered several deep bites on his arm. So he got into a fight and somebody bit him. All right, Poe pursued language studies exclusively. So that means he only studied language. He excelled in Latin and in French. But Allan, his dad, wanted him to study mathematics as well. Classmates remembered Poe taking long walks in the afternoon and entertaining friends in the evenings with poetry readings that included his own works. They also remember Poe experimenting with alcohol, although it was said that finishing one drink, quote, used him up. That just means he was a lightweight, so it didn't take a lot of alcohol to make him inebriated. He was not very tall and he was very thin, so that's probably why. All right, continuing here. Classmates described Poe as a very good looking fellow. He was about 5'8 and his frame was small. There you go. His eyes were large and full, gray and piercing. If you've never seen a picture of Edgar Allan Poe, I would encourage you to look one up. He had a fair complexion and his hair was dark as a raven's wing. Although Poe's clothes were clearly worn, he was always neat. So he didn't have always new clothes, but he did look very clean and put together. And he also spoke with a soft Southern accent because he was from Virginia. Well, he grew up in Virginia. He was born in Massachusetts, but was raised in Virginia. All right. Although he had high academic expectations for Poe, Allan failed to provide adequate funding for Poe's education. So Poe turned to gambling to try to raise needed funds. So his father wanted him to go to school, but either couldn't or didn't pay for it all the way. So Poe had to try to figure out how to pay for school himself. So he started gambling. In 1827, he had accumulated $2,000 or the equivalent of 2 years' salary in gambling debts. So however much money the average American makes a year times two. I think the average amount that American makes, I'm not 100% positive, but it's somewhere between 40 and 50,000. So we're talking 80 to $100,000 in debt if it were today. Poe asked Allan for the money, but Allan refused him, and this caused a division between Poe and his foster father. So he racked up this debt. He asked his dad to pay off the debt, and Allan said no. Right. Poe left the university and enlisted in the United States Army under the name Edgar A. Perry. And he did that because his creditors, people he owed money to, were after him, trying to find him. So he changed his name when he joined the Army. He was in the Army for 3 years. When he was 21, Allan helped secure him an appointment at West Point. West Point is a prestigious military academy. Again, Poe received very little financial support from Allan. Financial hardship, along with the realization that writing was his true vocation, led Poe to resign from West Point. So he realized he didn't have enough money to pay for it, and he wanted to be a writer. He did not want to be in the military. So when Allan, acting as Poe's guardian, refused to allow Poe to resign, Poe pursued the only other option available to him, dismissal. Poe was released after he purposely ignored roll calls and missed mandatory drills. So he had to have his father's permission to resign from West Point, and his father wouldn't give it. And so he got himself kicked out by purposely getting in trouble. He ignored roll calls and missed mandatory drills. Okay, here's another place to stop. You're also going to answer these questions along with the questions that go with the part I just read to you. What do you think about Edgar Allan Poe's foster father, Mr. Allan? Do you think Edgar Allan Poe was more creative or more structured? And do you think someone can be both creative and structured? So you're going to answer the questions that go or that are from the notes I just gave you and answer these think, pair, share questions. So we'll go ahead and stop the video now. Okay, on to Poe's relationships. Poe's foster father was not a consistent disciplinarian, and he and Poe were constantly at odds. So, a disciplinarian is someone who disciplines, right? A parent disciplines. And Poe's foster father, Allan, was not consistent. So, that's why we say he is sometimes spoiled because he got away with stuff and then he would get punished for things. So, he wasn't consistent in how he dealt with Poe. So Francis Allan, his dad, died in 1829, and for a while, sorry, that's not his dad, his mother, his foster mother, Frances Allan, died in 1829, and for a while, John Allan and Poe were reconciled due to their shared grief. So remember, they had been fighting over where he was going to go to school, who was going to pay for it, all that kind of stuff. And so then his mother dies, and his foster mom, adopted mom, she dies, and then his dad is upset because he lost his wife, and Poe's upset because he lost his mother. So from 1821 to 1825, Poe was engaged to Elmira Royster despite objections from both families. The engagement was officially broken off. So they were engaged for 4 years, but neither one of their families wanted them to be married. Poe was 27 years old when he married his 13-year-old cousin, Virginia Clem. They lived in Richmond, Virginia. This is not unusual to marry your cousin in the early 1800s, although they did have a pretty big age difference, as you can see. Poe and Clem did not have any children, and for the first 2 years of their married life, they pretended to be brother and sister. Poe and Clem were married 11 years. For 6 years before she died, she suffered from tuberculosis. So again, I kind of explained this before. It's a disease of the lungs that's transmitted through the air by coughing or sneezing, and it is bacterial. So that's why I said people don't die of tuberculosis anymore, because we can cure it with antibiotics. But in the 1800s, they didn't have antibiotics. All right, here's another place to stop. This is actually the end of this, I think. Nope. This is not an exit slip. This would have been an exit slip had we been in class. So yes, we're going to stop this lesson today. And we're just going to continue. I'll break it up as I need to. I'm sorry, you all. I'm trying to figure all this out on the fly. You're going to stop and answer the questions I just went over the material I just went over, and then these two questions. I think we already asked these questions, so forget I said that. Okay, Poe's time period. The field of medicine as we know it was now in its infancy, meaning it was just beginning. Medical students paid young men to dig up corpses to study. This was illegal and had to be done under the cover of darkness. During the time period, it was sometimes uncertain whether a body in a coffin was dead. In some cases, a bell was placed inside a coffin so it could be rung by the deceased. So sometimes people were buried alive. Maybe they were in a coma or something, and they eventually woke up, and so they would put little bells in the coffins to make sure that if someone was buried alive, they could let someone know and they could dig them up and get them out. The U.S. government's policies toward African Americans and Native Americans made these times particularly turbulent. In 1820, Congress passed the Missouri Compromise, which admitted Missouri to the Union as a slave state and Maine as a non-slave state, but also outlawed slavery in areas north of the latitude that comprises Missouri's southern border. In 1830, Congress ratified and implemented the Indian Removal Act, which created the forced migration of eastern Indian tribes to western lands. One of the worst of these migrations was the 1838 Trail of Tears, on which 4,000 of 15,000 Cherokee Indians lost their lives due to hunger, disease, exposure, and exhaustion. I don't know why that's underlined. Spiritual uncertainty was deepening. In the 1830s, geologists began to question scriptural accounts of the creation of the world. By the middle of the century, higher criticism, a kind of literary criticism, I don't want to read all this. Oh. All right, let's move on to Poe's career. Poe was one of the first American writers to make a living solely by writing. Poe often wrote anonymous pieces to prompt others to read his work. So that just means he would write like a letter or something to the newspaper telling the public to read Edgar Allan Poe, and he would sign a different name or sign it anonymously. Poe's career was hurt by the absence of an international copyright law. So instead of paying American writers, publishers often simply reproduced British works for their magazines. So Poe worked for some time as an editor for the Southern Literary Messenger in Richmond, Virginia. He left the magazine in 1839 and then worked for a series of newspapers, magazines, and journals publishing short stories at the same time. Although Poe began his career during a boom in publishing, most periodicals did not last long. Periodicals are magazines. and publishers often refused to pay their writers. The Panic of 1837, a financial crisis that ushered in a 5-year economic depression, also had a particularly bad impact on the industry. In his time, Poe was known as a good poet, or as a poet and a literary critic who also wrote stories. With the emergence of modern poetry and its emphasis on free verse, though, Poe's poetry fell out of favor. Free verse is a type of poetry that is use that word free, so it's open. It doesn't follow necessarily a structure or a rhyme scheme. It's free. It doesn't have rules. And Poe wrote poetry that rhymed. His poems rhyme. So when we read these, you're going to see that they rhyme. And so that was kind of an old way of doing it. And so that's why it says his poetry kind of fell out of public favor. They kind of stopped liking his work. So although he wanted to be a poet, Poe soon turned to prose or short stories in order to support himself, because that was what people wanted to read of his, because he didn't write free verse poetry. So Poe's best-known fictional works are Gothic, a genre that played to the public taste of the time. So we're going to talk about Gothic here. We should have already talked about it a little bit, but it's that it's kind of creepy, right? Gothic is kind of creepy. That's kind of the idea. He also wrote satires, fantasies, comedies, science fiction, a play, and a textbook on the study of shells. He was very well-rounded. So the comic side of Poe's work is often overlooked. He saw both the tragedy and the absurdity in life, and sometimes put them in the same story. Absurdity means the ridiculousness. So he saw the sadness and just how ridiculous life could be at the same time. Poe is considered the father of the detective story. He also earned the nickname the Man with the Tomahawk for his biting literary criticism. Some critics consider Poe a writer of Southern sensibilities, influenced by the South as it existed before the Civil War. He published during an era when writers from New England were predominant in the publishing world. On October 3rd, 1849, Poe, semi-conscious, was identified at a local tavern. His clothes were dingy and ill-fitting, which led many to believe that his original clothing had been stolen. Poe was taken to Washington College Hospital, where he drifted in and out of consciousness for days but never recovered enough to explain how he arrived at his condition. On October 7, Poe calmly prayed, "Lord, help my poor soul," and he died. His cause of death was ascribed to congestion of the brain, although no autopsy was performed. He was only 40 years old. Theories of the cause of Poe's death include the following: beating, epilepsy, dipsomania, which is an uncontrolled thirst for alcohol, meaning that he was simply an alcoholic and he just drank himself to death. Heart, toxic disorder, hypoglycemia, diabetes, alcohol, I don't even know how to say that. I don't know. Porphyria, delirium tremens, rabies, murder, and carbon monoxide poisoning. And then every year since 1949, on the anniversary of Poe's birth, an unknown visitor known as the Poe Toaster leaves a partial bottle of cognac and 3 roses on Poe's grave. While the significance of the cognac is unknown, the 3 roses are assumed to signify the 3 people buried under the cement: Poe, his mother-in-law, Maria Clem, and his wife, Virginia. All right, his influence. References to Poe and his literary works are still widespread in popular culture. For example, The Simpsons has parodied The Raven, with Lisa reading the poem to Bart and Maggie. The Lemony Snicket series, a series of unfortunate events, portrays Poe as the guardian of the Baudelaire children. The NFL's Baltimore Ravens are named after Poe's famous poem, The Raven, which we're going to read. The film Poe, The Last Days of the Raven, won the 2008 Grand Prize for Best Feature Film at the Cinema City International Film Festival in Los Angeles. Poe's life is also the subject of a movie entitled Poe, written and directed by Sylvester Stallone. And at one point, it was even rumored that Michael Jackson was reviewing scripts with a view to playing the writer, to playing Edgar Allan Poe. All right, so final thoughts. Is it important to know about an author's life to understand his or her work? Argue yes or no and support your arguments with your personal reading experience. And then number two, how does structure, style, characterization, and word choice all work together to create an impression on a reader? Support your ideas with examples from your own personal reading experience or think back to the gallery walk. All right, I guess that's it.